Hi, class, and welcome to Chapter 12, which will be on the central nervous system. It's divided into four parts, A through D. I'm just going to cover parts A and B tonight um, in this recording, and then I'll do the other second half. So pay attention to the lecture, and I'll try to focus on the things you should focus your studying on. So your central nervous system, as you remember from anatomy, consists of the brain and spinal cord. Cephalization has to do with the development of the rostral anterior portion of the central nervous system, resulting in an increased number of neurons and the highest level reached in the human brain. Embryologically, which has to do with how the brain develops in the womb, the brain and spinal cord begin as a neural tube, and the neural tube's anterior end expands and constrictions form into three vesicles: the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain, and then the posterior end becomes the spinal cord. The primary vesicles give rise to five secondary brain vesicles, which you might recognize some of these names from learning the anatomy of the brain. The telencephalon gives rise to two cerebral hemispheres, which will make up the cerebrum. The diencephalon gives rise to the epithalamus, the thalamus, hypothalamus, and retina. The mesencephalon remains the midbrain. It becomes the pons and the cerebellum. And eventually the myelencephalon becomes the medulla oblongata. The central cavity of the neural tube becomes the ventricles, which are the spaces within the brain. And this is just looking how during embryonic development of the human brain, how the neural tube eventually turns into vesicles, which eventually turns into five secondary vesicles into the adult brain structures. I don't think I ask you too many details of this, but it's just interesting to note and see how the brain does develop in the womb. The brain goes faster than surrounding membranous skull, so it must fold to occupy available space. The forebrain will move toward the brainstem, and then the cerebral hemispheres will double back and envelop the diencephalon and midbrain while creasing and folding to increase the surface area. So here's just a look at how the brain develops and the different structures that you can begin to see. Week 13, the cerebral hemispheres develop and grow posterior-laterally to enclose the diencephalon and the rostral brainstem. So you start to see here the medulla oblongata, the spinal cord, and then the pons and the midbrain coming out of the top. The adult brain then has four regions: the cerebral hemispheres, the diencephalon, the brainstem, which is your midbrain, pons, and medulla, and then the cerebellum. So this is a look at the adult brain, which is really what you should focus your studying on. I won't really ask you many questions about the developing fetal brain. The gray matter is short, non-myelinated neurons and cell bodies, and the white matter is myelinated and non-myelinated axons. The basic pattern found in your central nervous system is there's a central cavity surrounded by gray matter with the white matter external to the gray matter. Feature and changes of pattern, the spinal cord will exhibit this basic pattern. However, the pattern will change with ascent into the brainstem, so as it moves into the brainstem. So here we have a look at the spinal cord exhibiting the basic pattern of the central cavity filled with spinal fluid, the inner gray matter surrounding by outer white matter. And it does change as we get to a little bit more to the cerebrum part of the brain, but this is the basic distribution of gray and white matter in the central nervous system. The brainstem has additional gray matter nuclei scattered within the white matter. That has to do with how the nerve impulses get transferred. The cerebral hemispheres and the cerebellum contain an outer layer of gray matter, which we call the cortex. And the cerebrum and cerebellum also have scattered areas of gray matter nuclei amid the white matter, which again is important for how these nerve impulses get passed through up to the brain. So here's a look at the distribution of gray and white matter. If we look kind of at the brain stems, you can hear the central cavity, and then you see outer white matter, inner gray matter, but you also see additional regions of gray matter, which are the brain nuclei buried within the white matter. And then here's a look at how the cerebrum distributes its gray and white matter. You see a central cavity. Again, whenever you see a cavity that's filled with cerebral spinal fluid, and then you can see as well the white matter and then the outer gray matter or cortex. So you have ventricles within the brain, which are fluid-filled chambers that are continuous to one another and to the central canal, the spinal cord. They're all filled with cerebral spinal fluid, and they're lined by ependymal cells, which help to secrete and create that cerebral spinal fluid. You have paired lateral ventricles, which are large C-shaped chambers, and the pair of lateral ventricles is separated by a really thin membrane or a piece of tissue called the septum pellucidum. Each lateral ventricle is connected to the third ventricle via the interventricular foramen, and the third ventricle is connected to the fourth ventricle via the cerebral aqueduct. There's 3 openings that connect the fourth ventricle to the subarachnoid space that will surround the brain, which is just important because that will fill with fluid as well to help to protect the brain within the skull. So here's just a look at the ventricles of the brain. If you took anatomy in person, you might remember seeing this model that's grayish in color, showing the shape of these ventricles. And this is, again, these ventricles are spaces within the brain. They're filled with cerebral spinal fluid, and they help to give the brain buoyancy, so kind of make it lighter as if it's floating in the skull, and help to provide protection and cushioning so the brain isn't banging up against the skull itself. The cerebral hemispheres then form the superior part of the brain. They account for 83% of the brain mass. So important anatomical markings are the gyri, are the ridges or kind of brain folds. The sulci are shallow grooves within the gyri, and fissures are very deep grooves within those gyri or ridges. The longitudinal fissure separates the 2 hemispheres of the brain, and the transverse cerebral fissure separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum, which is in the back posterior part of the skull. So here's the lobes, sulci, and fissures of the cerebral hemispheres. A good review from anatomy, so make sure you understand all these anatomical terms, as well as understanding the different lobes of the brain and where they are located. And there's the cerebellum back there with the brain stem in front. So the sulci divide each hemisphere into the 5 lobes, which you should be familiar with from anatomy. The first 4 are named after what skull bone overlies them. So if you don't remember them from anatomy, hopefully you can figure it out knowing the skull bones. And then the 5th lobe is called the insular lobe, and that's buried under a portion of the temporal, parietal, and frontal lobes. Here's a great animation of a rotating brain to help to describe some of that anatomy. Here's another look at the lobes, sulci, and fissures of the cerebral hemisphere, just to see how the different lobes are separated out, and the colors help you determine where one lobe ends and another one begins. The central sulcus goes between goes kind of dividing the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The central sulcus is important because the gyrus in front and behind of the central sulcus are very important. The precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus both have really important motor and sensory functions that we'll talk about. So I really want you to pay attention to that precentral and postcentral gyrus. So, and then you can see the insular lobe as you pull back the temporal and frontal lobes. So this gets a little into that central sulcus. It separates the precentral gyrus from the postcentral gyrus. The parietal occipital sulcus will separate the occipital and parietal lobes, and then the lateral sulcus outlines the temporal lobes. Each hemisphere has 3 basic regions: the cerebral cortex, which is the gray matter most superficially to the brain. So if we were to take a look at a brain in a person, pull back the skull, we'd be looking at the cerebral cortex. So it would have a gray color to it. The white matter is internal to that. And then there's basal nuclei, which are clusters of nuclei deep within the white matter. So here's just another look at the anatomy of the brain. So the cerebral cortex is what we call the executive suite. It's the site of all conscious mind awareness, sensory perception, voluntary motor initiation, communication, memory storage, and understanding. It's a very thin cerebral layer of gray matter, and it takes up about 40% of the mass of the brain. PET scans and MRI scans show specific motor and sensory functions located in discrete cortical areas called domains, and higher functions can be spread over many areas. So some of the functions like seeing, hearing, speaking, and thinking all have specific parts of the brain where their functions are located. And a PET or an MRI scan can show if a part of the brain is dysfunction or not operating correctly when that part of the brain is stimulated. So there's 4 general considerations of the cerebral cortex. They contain 3 types of functional areas: motor areas, sensory areas, and association areas. Motor control voluntary movement, and sensory areas control conscious awareness. Each hemisphere is concerned with contralateral opposite side of the body. So that means if a motor, if you're controlling the right arm, that sensory and motor information is coming from the left side of the brain. Lateralization or specialization of cortical function can occur in only one hemisphere, and conscious behavior involves the entire cortex in one way or another. So here are the motor areas. They're located in the frontal lobe. They act to control voluntary movement. The primary motor cortex is located in that precentral gyrus. The premotor cortex is directly anterior to that. The Broca's area is anterior to the premotor area, and then you have a frontal eye field within the anterior to premotor cortex. So here's just a look at the functional instructional areas of the cerebral cortex. There's a lot of information here. I want you to know generally what each area does and what its importance. So the motor areas are generally in the frontal lobe. The sensory areas are in the parietal lobe. So I do want you to know the general function of each area of the brain. The primary motor cortex, again, is located in the precentral gyrus. You have pyramidal cells there, pyramidal tracts. Somatotopy consists of all muscles of the body can be mapped to an area on the primary motor cortex. And we call this a motor homunculi, which is an upside down caricature drawing that represent contralateral motor innervation of body regions. And this is really cool to see, as you can see here. So this is a motor map of the somatosensory and primary motor cortex areas of the brain. So each side of the brain controls the opposite side of the body. So the motor cortex in the precentral gyrus, different parts of the cortex of the brain will control these areas of the brain. So you can see here, there's a large part of the brain for your fingers and thumb and hand and wrist. And then the primary somatosensory cortex, which is located in the postcentral gyrus. So each side of the brain controls, again, the opposite side of the body. You can see which part of the brain will sense different sensory stimuli from the lips, the face, the nose. Again, the fingers and thumb have large areas. The knee, the hip, and leg don't have as much. So it's just really kind of cool to see this mapped out. So brain surgeons are able to know exactly what part of the brain is dysfunctioning based on the motor and sensory output to a certain side of the body and to a certain body part. So the premotor cortex helps plan movements. It's the staging area for skilled motor activities. It controls your learned, repetitious, or pattern motor skills. Think of riding a bike. It coordinates simultaneous or sequential actions, and it controls voluntary actions that depend on sensory feedback. Broca's area and frontal eye field, I'll let you guys read through those and what they are important for. And again, here's the functional and structural areas of the cerebral cortex. Here's a look at a mid-sagittal view or a parasagittal view. So if we were to cut the cerebrum in half, to look at where some of these areas are located if we were to look at the inside of the brain. Damage to areas of your primary motor cortex, as seen in a stroke, could paralyze muscles controlled by those areas. And paralysis always occurs on opposite sides of the body from the damage, because the damage to the brain will always control the opposite side of the body. Muscle strength, or the ability to perform discrete individual movements, is not usually impaired. Only control over those movements is lost. So, for example, damage to the premotor area controlling movement of the fingers would still allow the fingers to move, but the voluntary control needed to type would be lost. Other premotor neurons can be reprogrammed to take over the skill if they are damaged. It would require lots of practice, just as the initial learning process did. So here then, the sensory areas. And these are the areas of the cerebral cortex concerned with conscious awareness of sensation. And you have lots of different areas, 8 main areas that have to do with conscious awareness sensation. The primary somatosensory cortex is located in the postcentral gyrus. This helps receive information from your skin and your proprioceptors of your skeletal muscle, joints, and tendons. It's capable of spatial discrimination, or the identification of a body region being stimulated. And again, the somatosensory homunculus is the upside down caricatures drawings that represent contralateral sensory input from body regions. So again, here's a look at the body map and the primary motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex of the cerebrum. Somatosensory association cortex is posterior. It will integrate sensory input. It will determine the size, texture, and relationship of parts of objects being felt. Then you have visual areas and where they're located, visual association areas, which uses past visual experiences to interpret visual stimuli. Auditory areas, they're located in the temporal lobes, which will help determine pitch, loudness, and location. And then auditory association areas stores memories of sounds and permits perception of sound stimulus. The vestibular cortex is the posterior part of the insula and adjacent parietal cortex. It's responsible for conscious awareness of balance, such as the position of head in space. The olfactory cortex is located in the medial aspect of the temporal lobes, and it's involved in conscious awareness of odors. Gustatory cortex has to do with the perception of taste, located in the insula, and then the visceral sensory cortex is the posterior to the gustatory cortex, and this gives you the conscious perception of visceral sensations, such as an upset stomach or a full bladder. All right, and again, some looks at the anatomy where it's located. If you have damage to your primary visual cortex, it results in functional blindness. And by contrast, individuals with a damaged visual association area can see, but they do not comprehend what they're looking at. Multimodal association areas, I'm going to skip over these for right now. Again, more association areas that help to give meaning to information received, store in memory, tie to a previous experience, and decide on actions. Anterior association areas, these are involved with intellect, cognition, recall, and personality. I'm going to skip over some of these, what I've covered so far, what I want you guys to focus on. Posterior association areas plays a role in recognizing patterns in faces and localizing us in space. And this is where you have kind of some involvement of understanding of the written and spoken language. The limbic association area is part of the limbic system, and it provides emotional impact that makes a scene important to us to help establish memories. Tumors or other lesions of the anterior association area may cause mental or a personality disorder, including the loss of judgment, attentiveness, or inhibition. And the affected individual may be oblivious to a social restraint, perhaps becoming careless about personal appearance, or taking unneeded risks. Different problems also could arise for individuals with lesions in part of the posterior association area. So an individual may refuse to wash or dress the side of the body opposite to the lesion because that doesn't belong to me. So they don't have this awareness of their self in space. The brain is just incredibly interesting to study, if you're still with me so far. Lateralization has to do with the division of labor between hemispheres. So the hemispheres are not identical. Cerebral dominance refers to the hemisphere that is dominant for language. 90% of humans have left-sided dominance, which usually results in right-handedness. And in another 10%, the roles of the hemispheres can be reversed. So the left hemisphere usually controls language, math, and logic, and the right hemisphere of the brain controls visual, spatial skills, intuition, emotion, and artistic and musical skills. So you might hear the saying that someone is more left-brained than right-brained. The hemispheres do communicate instantaneously via fiber tracks and functional integration. So that's part A, and let's go ahead and try to get through part B. And then I will do part C and D in a different PowerPoint or a different lecture presentation too. Okay, so part B, we're going to go a little more through the nervous system, talking about the cerebral white matter. The cerebral white matter consists of myelinated fibers bundled into tracts, and they're classified according to the direction they run: association, commissural, and projection fibers. So these are the different tracks of the cerebral white matter depending on where they run. And they're important for how they run and how they connect different parts of the gray matter or different parts of the hemispheres together. So this is a look at the white fiber tracks of cerebral hemispheres. And again, they're important because they connect hemispheres, they connect white to gray matter, and different nervous stimuli will run through different tracks. So think of these white fiber tracks as these nervous system's way of connecting itself to each other. Again, a look at the tracks and how they connect different parts of the brain together. The third of the three basic regions of the cerebrum is the basal nuclei or ganglia. In each hemisphere's basal nuclei include a caudate nucleus, putamen, and the globus pallidus. They're closely associated with the subthalamic nuclei and substantia nigra, which is the midbrain. The basal nuclei are again important for their function that we'll talk about in a little bit. The functions of the basal nuclei are important in the influence of muscle movements. They play a role in cognition and emotion. They regulate intensity of slow or stereotyped movements. They filter out incorrect or inappropriate responses, and they inhibit antagonistic or an unnecessary movement. Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease are disorders of the basal nuclei. So it will influence greatly muscle movements, cognition, emotion, and intensity or slow movement. So Parkinson's disease is sometimes stereotyped by tremors, so the inability to kind of control the shaking of the hands. So here's a look at where basal nuclei is located throughout the brain. The diencephalon then consists of three paired gray matter structures: the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus, and all three enclose the third ventricle. And this is another great animation, which will show a rotating brain. So now we're going to focus on the diencephalon, the hypothalamus and thalamus. All right, so let's take a look. The thalamus, first of all, makes about 80% of the diencephalon. It contains several nuclei named for its function. It's a bilateral egg-shaped structure shown here. So the thalamus contains several bilobed nuclei within it. And the main function of the thalamus that I do want you guys to know is that it is the relay center for all information coming into the cortex of the brain. So it will sort, edit, and relay ascending input like impulses from your hypothalamus for regulating emotion and visceral function, impulses from the cerebellum and basal nuclei to help direct motor cortices, impulses for memory or sensory integration, and overall it acts to mediate sensation, motor activities, cortical arousal, learning, and memory. The hypothalamus is then located below the thalamus. It contains many important nuclei like the mammillary bodies, which act as olfactory relay stations, and also the infundibulum, which is the stalk that connects it to the pituitary gland. So here's a look at the hypothalamus with the infundibulum stalk connecting it to the pituitary gland. The thalamus' main function is to control and regulate homeostasis. So it controls autonomic nervous system, your blood pressure, rate and force of your heartbeat, digestive tract motility and pupil size. And it also initiates physical responses to emotion, perceives pleasure, fear, rage, biological rhythms, as well as the drive, such as the sex drive. The hypothalamus also regulates body temperature like sweating, shivering, hunger, satiety in response to nutrient levels, regulating water balance and thirst, regulating sleep and wake cycles. And the big thing about the hypothalamus as well that I want you to know is that it controls endocrine system, like it controls what is being secreted from the anterior pituitary gland, and it also produces all the posterior pituitary hormones. Hypothalamic disturbances cause a number of disorders like severe body wasting, obesity, sleep disturbances, dehydration, emotional imbalances, and it can be damaged by a tumor, radiation, surgery, or trauma. The epithalamus then is the most dorsal portion of the diencephalon. It forms the roof of the third ventricle, and it contains the pineal gland, which extends from the posterior body. And the pineal gland or body is important for secreting melatonin that helps to regulate your sleep and wake cycles. So here's a look at some of the structures we've been talking about, the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, and the thalamus. Here's another view of the brainstem and the diencephalon in purple. And just another view of that. So feel free to pause the lecture at any time to take a look at those pictures. The brainstem then consists of the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Contains many nuclei, controls many autonomic behaviors, and contains many fiber tracts that connect the higher and lower neural centers together. So we'll look at the brainstem now, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So the midbrain is located between the diencephalon and the pons. It contains cerebral peduncles, which form pillars that hold up the cerebrum. There's like two ventral bulges that contain pyramidal motor tracts. And then the cerebral aqueduct is a channel running through the midbrain that connects the third and fourth ventricles together. The periaqueductal gray matter, don't worry about that. And here again is the look at the brainstem and the diencephalon in purple. The midbrain contains nuclei scattered throughout the white matter, including these structures. And then the red nucleus relays nuclei for some of the descending limb flexion motor pathways. All right, cross section. The pons then is located between the midbrain and the medulla oblongata. The fourth ventricle separates the pons from the cerebellum. It's composed of conduction tracts that help to relay impulses from the higher brain centers in the spinal cord. It has the origin of many cranial nerves in the pons. And here's a look at the cross section through different regions of the brain, looking at the pons. The medulla oblongata is also known as the medulla. It blends into the spinal cord at the foramen magnum. It contains the fourth ventricle. It also contains the choroid plexus that helps to form the cerebral spinal fluid. There's structures of the medulla oblongata that are shown here. The pyramids, the decussation of the pyramids is the point where the pyramidal tracts cross over to opposite sides of the body. And we're going to talk more about decussate, which is just crossing over. Also contains other cranial nerves, more nuclei, and a different nucleus, cuneatus and gracilis. All right, so you can see here there's a lot of information and I'm skipping over some of it. So focus on kind of the parts that I'm talking about. The big picture function of the medulla oblongata is an autonomic reflex center. It functions overlap with the hypothalamus. It helps to include the cardiovascular center to help adjust the force and the rate of the heart contraction and help to adjust blood vessel diameter for blood pressure regulation. The respiratory center is in the medulla oblongata to help to control the rate and depth of breathing, as well as various other centers like vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, and sneezing. The cerebellum then is 11% of the brain mass. It's located dorsal to the pons and medulla, and it processes input from the cortex, the brainstem, and sensory receptors to provide precise coordinated movements of skeletal muscles, as well as playing a very important role in balance. The cerebellar anatomy then, so your cerebellar hemispheres are connected by worm-like vermes. The folia is the transversely oriented gyri, and each hemisphere has 3 lobes. It contains a thin cortex of gray matter with distinct tree-like pattern of white matter called the arbor vitae. Purkinje fibers will originate in the cortex. They'll synapse with the cerebellum, and the cerebellar homunculi shows sensory maps of the entire body. So again, here's a look at the cerebellum with the arbor vitae, which looks like a tree-like branching of white matter. Here's a look again at the cerebellum with the arbor vitae and the different lobes. And here's again a look at that cerebellum. All fibers in the cerebellum are ipsilateral, which means they go to and from the same side of the body. There's different fiber tracks that connect the cerebellum to the brainstem, as shown there. Cerebellar processing, it fine-tunes motor activities to initiate voluntary muscle control. It really helps with balance and coordination of fine muscle movement. Neuroimaging suggests that cerebellum plays roles in thinking, language, and emotion. As it does for motor processes, it may compare actual output of higher functions with expected output and adjust accordingly. So here's a look at the cerebellum homunculus and the sensory areas that it controls in the location of it. And that's the end of part B, and I'll do part C and D in another recording, and thanks for listening.